Okay, Ehson, we are live. Is it Ehson?
You nailed it. Yeah, Ehson.
Ehson. Great. Cool. So right, so we're live. So those of you who know the format of the stuff I'm doing is all well and good. I just need to put my batch back in. For those of you who don't, these are live streamed interviews. As you will probably know, myself and Dr. Amy Redmond are writing a book about innovation, leadership, digital transformation within the built environment. And as a consequence, we are interviewing a whole load of people. Hardly any of that will ever make a book, which has to be quite prescribed and succinct. Whereas I think a lot of the interviews that we're doing with all of these people from all around the world are going to be really useful as a bank of content for people to learn and have good examples of best practice. So stream all of these stuff very kindly. Everybody that I'm interviewing is very, very okay with that. So hopefully this gives you the best of all worlds, really. So the book in 2024, and then all the content in the sort of run up to it. Ehson, just perhaps as a starting point, it'd be really useful just to understand a little bit of sort of your background, and perhaps why I reached out to you in the first place as a reason for sort of why this interview's come about. It'd be good to get your views.
Yeah, happy to do it, James. So at the ripe age of 29 here, I've been in the real estate industry for over a decade, if you include my internships back in college. So I've always been really interested in real estate, and can't really tell you why. I don't really want to go into that because it's not that interesting. But what is interesting is having gone to Stanford, everything had a tech lens on it, and the promise of technology was gospel. And I always kind of looked at the industry and kind of thought to myself, well, why hasn't this been disrupted yet? And in my kind of 19-year-old mind, that wasn't a very sophisticated thought process. It's just these people are really freaking old. They don't use a whole lot of technology. They're still collecting paper checks in a lot of situations. Like, it just seems like there's a lot of low-hanging fruit and room for innovation. And as I kind of worked within the industry, and I've taken a pretty unique career path, I think, in the sense that I've worked at, a logistics operating company. That really honestly has nothing to do with real estate. That's like an industrial real estate tenant, if anything.
Yeah.
But I've also worked in the corporate VC group of San Francisco's largest landlord. I've worked at the largest apartment private equity firm in North America. And now I'm at a REIT and on the investments team. And so I've seen a lot of different angles of the business. And as I've learned more about the business, I've learned why it is just so difficult to disrupt and innovate, and in some ways why they are so insulated from it. It's a very strategic industry with a downright overwhelming number of extremely talented professionals. And so it is... I've come to really respect the amount of thought and strategy that goes into what it takes to be successful in real estate. And I'm happy to talk about kind of, what the big drivers of success are, quote unquote. But that's a little bit about my background, and I've seen a lot of different facets, and happy to dive in anywhere that you might find interesting.
Cool. No, that'd be good. I mean, let me start by, and I mentioned this to you very, very briefly in the sort of the green room, if that is so pronounced. I have the great pleasure of traveling all over the place. I'm currently randomly in Serbia for a conference tomorrow, and I have a lot of insights from all around the world. But one of the I suppose the least transparent market for me is North America. My network is probably weakest in North America. The amount of conferences I've attended has been the least in North America. The prop tech ecosystem, if we're going to be quite nuanced around that in particular area, or construction technology or anything like that, has got no structure in North America compared to all of the other markets that I'm aware of. Why is that? What is it about North America, which is seemingly one of the largest markets, which seems to have the least amount of coordination, if that's probably the best word? You got any thoughts on that as a...
I have some, but I would like to clarify if you mean as it relates to prop tech specifically, or as it relates to the real estate industry in general.
One and both. So start with, if you've got any thoughts about it in terms of prop tech in and of itself, but then actually that innovation piece as well, I think would be quite interesting, because I know you have that sort of particular specialism around the innovation piece in the region.
Yeah, look, I don't want to sort of overstep my competency here or my knowledge, but I'll give you my perception of it. So real estate is a very long-term strategic business, and it's a cost of capital business. And this is really important to understand because you're seeing it today when financing becomes more scarce, and equity becomes more scarce. Those firms that have a lower cost of capital are more competitive by orders of magnitude to those who don't. And cost of capital is not something that changes overnight. It takes years and years of strategy and access to the right LPs or limited partners or outside investors. It takes building the right portfolio, one transaction at a time, where transactions can take, 30 days minimum. Usually you're chasing a deal for months before it actually closes. So it is like, and this is like one of the things that I've kind of learned the hard way, is I kind of came in and I was like, why doesn't just somebody come in with like data and like a really clean like pipeline platform, I think like Salesforce for real estate, and just disrupt the hell out of this thing. And every time I've seen somebody try to do that, they get out over their skis and they wind up with the wrong cost of capital, and they get wiped out sometimes, or other times they really struggle in times like we're seeing today. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I can speak to this. I worked at Greystar, which is a big multifamily investor. And we had a competitor kind of pop out of the woodwork, and you can go read about these guys. Actually, I don't know these guys, so I'll just name them. Tides Equities. And they kind of popped up on the scene, and they had like what was considered innovative, right? They were doing value add multifamily projects. And they would place their kind of distribution centers, it's not exactly it, but for lack of a better word, where they would hold kind of everything they needed for the renovation very close to the properties that they're renovating. And so that was kind of their pitch to their investors, is like, look, we're just going to do these renovations faster than everybody else. We're executing on deals faster than everybody else. And in a lot of cases, they really were. And they were outbidding everybody. And they grew to like a $5 billion AUM within just a few years, kind of just prior to and going into the pandemic. And now if you kind of go read about them, you'll see that they're underwater on quite a few loans. They're having to ask for extensions from their investors. And so this is not to say that like it's a, and I hope they figure it out and do well. I mean, this is not a knock on them, like good on them for trying, but it really is like you have to build slowly and strategically. And the most important things are your access to investors, your cost of capital. And so like really like those are people aspects of the business. That's not technology or anything else. And it doesn't matter how good you crunch the numbers. So that's like a long-winded answer, but part of the reason why.
But just to pick that out then. So the North American market is different in your view because there is just a legacy aspect to all of those factors. Is that what you're saying? And as a consequence, that's the reason, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think because those are the driving factors in the business, to sort of unpack and I guess get back to your question, is like when those are the most important aspects of your business, you're going to be quite guarded about a lot of things for good measure. I mean, you'll hear a lot of people in the States describe real estate as a sharp elbows business, and I never really understood what the heck that really means, but it is a access business in a really big way. I mean, in maybe more so than even venture capital, and maybe a lot of people don't realize. So you're not going to get a lot of people who want to like open up and tell you everything. It just doesn't benefit them to do so. You're not going to get a lot of people who want to introduce you to their LP because why would they? Because if they've got a good relationship there, that is a significant competitive advantage for them. So I think that's one of the reasons, and I wouldn't necessarily use the word Machiavellian, but it is, I've grown in my respect for the level of strategy and secrecy, which honestly are paramounted at any successful company. But within real estate, folks are really, really careful, and it's for good reason.
No, very true. So let's go back in the story a little bit. I reached out to you through LinkedIn because of a post that I'd seen that I think you and Brad Hargreaves compile a quarterly report on technology and innovation within some of the sort of the larger real estate firms within the US. And that for me is quite interesting because, as I said, it's quite a hidden market for me. And if I'm not mistaken, you sort of listen to all the sort of the quarterly calls from these businesses in terms of their reporting back to their shareholders and sort of market reports, and you're analysing the sort of the discussions around technology and innovation. Is that a fair overview, just to sort of put that as a basic discussion?
Yeah, that's effectively what we're doing. Yeah.
Cool. So tell me, where do you feel these businesses are at the moment in their innovation and technology attitudes? Where is the market in those large businesses that you talked about?
Yeah, so I guess I can start with a little more background to why we're doing what we're doing. So credit goes to Brad for the idea, and we just wanted to kind of track what real estate businesses are doing as it relates to technology. And it started kind of really crude with us just listening to calls, and quite literally, like, we would hear the word technology or innovation, we would start taking notes. Yeah. But we've had 2 iterations, and in our second, we expanded our keyword search. We did speaker ID. So we started doing some things that are a little more sophisticated, try to get an understanding of kind of where firms stand. And I still don't think what we're doing is rocket science, but we'll get there as we move.
But as you say, you're taking the hard work out of it for people who are interested in this area.
Exactly. And so my sort of synopsis thus far has been this. There are those firms that are now really focused on technology, and it really does kind of break out nearly 50-50. About 50% of companies they talk about technology in their kind of opening statements coming from a CEO or somebody very high up at the company. They are investing in prop tech. They have technology advisory businesses internally. They're looking really closely at demand and how technology drives that demand, whether it be AI driving office space in San Francisco, or increasing the earning potential of certain groups of folks in urban areas, and how that might impact residential demand. And then there's also a lot of firms that are highly focused on how they're using data and analytics within their businesses, which is becoming more and more important. And then there's another 50% of firms that really just don't even brush on the topic at all. And
let me just ask a quick question on that.
Sure.
Do you feel that's because they don't feel that those earnings calls are the place to discuss technology and innovation?
In some cases, yes. In fact, I know for a fact there are quite a few, and it's also important to keep in mind, like, what we have here is a small sliver of the real estate industry, as you pointed out. Like, quite a lot of it, it's hard to even figure out what's going on or what they're up to. But we focused on the public REITs because this is where you can actually find public information. You can hear how they're talking about it. And even within the REITs, there are a good number of them that I know for a fact are using data and analytics really strategically. Are thinking about supply and demand within the context of the best tech tools and the best data that's out there. And I mean, those are extremely, like, critical uses of technology within real estate. I mean, not everything needs to be techified and productized. I mean, it really doesn't. And that's especially true within the real estate industry. So we're using a broad definition of technology here. And you have to keep in mind, like, when I talk about technology within real estate, there's certain things that really move the needle and other things don't. But going back to what I was saying within like public perception, I do think, and I have noticed this throughout my career, that because perhaps technology hasn't been so impactful on real estate historically, there is an attitude at some firms, either because they think it's not important, or I actually don't, I can't really put my finger on what it is, but they will just ignore it almost as like a matter of like principle or culture. And I don't think that that's wise. I think those firms, there's some firms that are aware of what's going on, maybe as it relates to their tenants, maybe as it relates to their business lines, but not necessarily like deploying a bunch of tech tools within their business. And I think that's fine too. But there's a group that just absolutely avoids it, and I can't really figure that one out. It's.
Do you think that's sort of like a head in the sand type approach to it, which is if it isn't broke, don't fix it. We'll keep on doing what we're doing.
I think there's some of that. I think,
or is it an attitude of it's risky? And
no.
So just on that, because I'm just going to pick up on that. Maybe risk is the wrong word, but I was talking yesterday about a book that I'm currently going through called Creative Construction, which is a really fantastic book looking at innovation and how businesses transform and how you can do that. And they talk a lot about the challenges leadership has around ambiguity and uncertainty, in the sense of, with a lot of the innovations that we have, because the output and the metrics of success are not necessarily concrete, it means it's very difficult for leaders to make a calculated decision that they'll go down that line. So is that perhaps, in your view, maybe why it is, or is it entirely different?
Yeah, I do think I think that's a big part of it. That latter thing, the last thing you just mentioned. I think there is some anxiety around it. I think traditionally maybe they haven't had access to great tech talent, or maybe there's just a lot of these firms have what I would call an old guard. They have folks that have been in the industry for decades, and what they've done thus far has worked. And maybe they just don't have a lot of young perspective. I mean, I will also say, like, I actually think like real estate is probably one of the most hierarchical industries in the world. And as we know, most great companies are not run by hierarchy. I mean, that's gospel now. And so I think that is one area where they all are, where real estate is vulnerable. And I think at those companies where that top brass just hasn't had the exposure, maybe they think tech is stupid. Maybe they think it's risky. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because you can experiment with tech quite inexpensively. So where's the risk? I just think it's a general lack of understanding that does lead to that kind of head in the sand mindset a little bit. And I think it's important to look at what's going on around you in the world, because it could be pretty relevant to your business soon. So
yeah, no, I agree, and it's interesting you talk about hierarchy. I was in Hong Kong. Jesus, was it last week? Yeah, it was last week. I was in Hong Kong, and I posted a clip where I said that I see two sort of states of inertia coming out of Far Asia, which was number one. Well, the important bit in this was about hierarchical deference. In the sense that they were deferring to sort of the people at the top of the tree, and that was quite interesting for me to see. And it seems that there might be a similar thing around very traditional US firms that we're talking about there, whereas there is a hierarchy, and if that hierarchy hasn't made that decision to go down that line, it doesn't get done. Do you feel that's fair as well, or is that am I simplifying it too much?
No, I think that's very fair. I don't think anybody would really disagree with you there. It's a very top-down industry. I think, that's not to say there aren't REITs and PE firms that are more flat in their organization, that have more of a bottoms-up approach, that encourage opinions. But I think by and large, it is tops down, and it's committees, and it is a few people making the key decisions.
Do you think that's because of the nature of a REIT?
What do you mean the nature?
As in the sort of the business model and the level of risk that they are allowed to take on, the public nature of their business. Is that why it's a much slower, steadier form of leadership, whereas perhaps a developer, a landlord, a specific landlord can deal with things slightly differently because the business model is not the same as a REIT. It's not as traditional as that.
Well, what's a REIT really? It's a fiduciary, right, to their shareholders, and so I wouldn't really compare it to maybe a more entrepreneurial real estate company. I would compare it to another fiduciary, which would be, say, a bank or a PE fund or even a tech company in some cases, right? Like these are all companies that have public shares that have a responsibility to their shareholders, and a lot of tech companies manage considerably more money than any REIT for that matter, and do so in a much more bottoms up way and in a less hierarchical way. So I don't think it's that necessarily. I think it's the fact, I think it goes back to what I was saying originally, which is it's a cost of capital business, where long-term, the right long-term strategy and relationships win. And I think it's in a lot of cases, it's because those folks that are ultimately making those decisions have had those relationships for a very long time. And so they want to influence decisions to make sure that their stakeholders stay happy. I think that's probably a really big part of it.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, I have said for a long time, Ehson, that it's a personal appetite to risk rather than a business appetite to risk. And you echo a lot of the thoughts that I've had for a long time, which is they have reached a certain level within an organization. They may have been in the organization for a long time. They may be 5 or 10 years away from retirement and getting out. And there is a personal aspect of their legacy and they don't want to fuck it up. Basically, that's as simple as it is.
I think that's a lot of it. And look, in a lot of cases, that's justified. Like there's absolutely nothing.
But do you know the interesting thing for me? And by the way, I'm just going to say, Chris and Simon, I've seen some of your questions coming in. They're actually not coming into this, but they're actually coming into my phone. Thanks for that. And I think, Simon, I'm going to bring your question in a minute because that's quite an interesting one. And I think you're probably right. I use a football analogy a lot when it comes to the leadership of very large global real estate businesses. And it's a little bit like the Man United situation. So I don't know if you're a soccer football fan, but I often look at leadership as being what Man United is still going through, which is when Alex Ferguson was the manager at Man United, they were the most successful team in the world. I mean, he won everything. And he was there for years, for decades even. Mm-hmm. He left, and still the team, almost a decade later, still is nowhere near the heights of where it was when he was in charge because they didn't plan after he left. And it's the same, I think, in terms of the real estate world, in the sense of, the leader plans for their tenure, and we're not good enough at planning for succession and getting after that. But we're going to go down a tangent.
Well, and some people are, and some succession plan better than others. But here's what I'll make another analogy for our stateside folks here. If tech companies are the NBA, then the real estate companies or REITs are the NFL. And I don't know how familiar you are with the NBA and the NFL, but I think
Mate, I'm a huge Packers fan. I absolutely yeah.
And I want to unpack that a little bit because I think what that means is you'll see the NBA will experiment on an annual basis quite significantly. This season they're doing like an in-season tournament, totally new thing. They've got crazy colors on their courts. They did a bubble during COVID. Like they do all these things, right? And they're constantly experimenting in what would be perceived as, really risky things. Whereas if you see the NFL make a change, it's going to be extremely small. And it's going to be incremental to what they were doing before because it is more risk averse. They've got a good thing going and they've got a great reputation. And so they don't really want to mess it up. And so I do think some of it does come down to just how do you personally view risk? How much do you want to experiment? And look, like they've both had success in their own right. You could perhaps call one more innovative than the other, but does that make the NBA a better business? a lot of cases, no.
Yeah, no, it's a good analogy, very good analogy. So just a comment because I want to move on from this one, but Chris has said, I think leadership generally doesn't understand tech and how to approach it or apply it, especially in Cree, which I think is fair enough. Simon asked a question, and I actually think this is worth boiling into because it's relevant to the wider leadership discussion rather than technology discussion, which I think we sort of led down, because I think you said it yourself that this is more of a people thing that is a tech thing, and I agree with you. Simon says, do these businesses hesitate because their business is about following the market, not leading the changes that are perhaps needed? Any thoughts on that?
There might be.
And by the way, just while you're thinking that, I'm going to say, Simon, I think there is an element of all the stuff that I've done around the world analyzing leadership. There is most definitely a feeling of I don't want to be the first. And about 5 years ago, I think I did a survey when I was still with Unisu, and one of the biggest resistance to change was we want to see what everybody else is doing first. So I think you're probably fair. Ehson, do you disagree? Agree? Feel there's an element?
I'm giving it thought because it's an interesting question. In some senses, real estate is a commodity, and it is a secondary business in the sense that there will be some driver of demand first, and then real estate will benefit from that tailwind. For example, and this is not to get into any kind of specifics, I'm just kind of making stuff up here, but let's say I'm a multifamily investor. I might be really interested in, the Phoenix, Arizona MSA because TSMC just built, a giant, multi-billion-dollar plant out there. So like in that sense, it is a little bit of they're a follower business. Like I kind of see what Simon is saying there, but I do think there may be a couple other dynamics at play here. Like I think what you mentioned, James, about being the second to go, that's a little bit different, right? That's more in terms of the actual like real estate business. And I'll give you a good example. Like innovation in a lot of senses is experimenting really cheaply and then figuring out if it worked and then investing more if it did, and then, kind of cutting your losses if it didn't. It's really difficult to experiment cheaply in real estate because if you have a good cost of capital, it's because you're doing things at scale. So if you're competitive, you're building things at scale. And so the cheapest experiment you could do on any single development might be hundreds of millions of dollars. And so that's why you might see like companies move second, so to speak. And I think like, I'll give you an example. So when I was like 19 or 20, I interned at Prologis. And I think that company, whether they had a crystal ball or just kind of found themselves in the right place at the right time, are geniuses because they were sort of the first movers on this like distribution center business before anybody even knew what e-commerce was really, or how significant it would be. So because of that, they've been incredibly well positioned for a couple of decades now, and they've done really well. And then you found maybe what I would call a second mover, or somebody who's got a bigger scale and a lower cost of capital, who needs to be more conservative, like say Blackstone, moved into that business like very heavily in, I don't know the exact dates, but maybe in the late 2000s, early 2010s, sort of. And then really like in earnest, like kind of like in the mid 2010s. So in that case, they did let somebody else do the experimenting for them, so to speak, and then they moved in. And then like an even more conservative company might move after that, right? And so I do think there's a little bit of that, but there's also like that in the sense of like how you're innovating in your product types or your business lines or the segments you work with is very different to how you implement technology on a day-to-day basis within your teams. How you productize the tools that your team uses, how you use data and analytics, how you foster innovation in terms of the internal working dynamics. Things as simple as how frequently and how people meet, right? I think like those are things that you can probably experiment pretty inexpensively at a lot of companies. And they don't need to be so rigid in culture. And you know, I don't want to get into names here, but like credit where it's due. I know there are some folks, for example, who are looking into how you can use GPT within a real estate team to work more efficiently. Like, huge thumbs up. That's awesome. At least they're thinking about it, right? And they're experimenting with it, and it's worth an experiment. And I hope everybody out there is doing that, right? And it's
I was just going to say, so talking about technologies there for a second.
Yeah,
I'm only cutting in because I'm very conscious that you've got to start your working day, whereas I'm coming to the end of mine, and I don't want to hold you up.
But we love Serbia, by the way, so enjoy it while you're there. We got a Serbian in the family here, so we like it a lot.
I literally, I was a 3 a.m. start this morning, and it's now nearly 4. So, but you talked earlier on about when you're listening to these earnings calls from the large firms in the US. You talked about 50% of them are sort of they're not ready, they're not doing anything. They're some of them are actively not, and then 50% are.
Yeah.
You mentioned, I think, AI and data as being two of the trends you're picking up on. You just expand on those two a little bit, and if you've got any examples, you don't have to name the names of them, but any examples of how they're being used would be fantastic. And are there any other tech trends you're picking up on from these calls?
Yeah, I think AI has made accessing data, consolidating it, and deriving insights from it a little bit easier in recent years. And so I do think there's a lot of firms that are doing a really good job of both using the data that's publicly available or from third parties and collecting data internally to derive their own proprietary data sets and insights. Frankly, the competitive firms are doing this at a pretty high level, and it's table stakes now. As it relates to this AI trend that people are talking about this year, I want to be really clear. I think most people kind of miss the boat on what this really is. I think some of the more sophisticated venture capitalists are speaking about this the right way, and they'll call them large language models. And that's really what they are. This latest innovation, I think of GPT, and I've said this a lot of times, it's like your TI-83 for language. Yeah. So computers aren't better than humans at most things. There's a couple areas where they are. And until recently, it was like math and computation. Now it's language. It's like there are these language calculators. They can just spit out language and do it better than a human and faster in a lot of cases. And they also are good at accessing a data set, which in a lot of cases is just the internet or a search tool, Bing, Google, and then converting that into language. So really it's these LLMs. Right. And so that's AI. And I feel like that's probably what I just said, that little 30-second spiel is probably not really very well understood at most real estate firms for a lot of reasons. But I think what the smarter firms are seeing and are doing they're realizing that this new trend is driving a new ecosystem of companies that's driving office demand, that's driving residential demand, that is creating, it actually didn't make it into our latest article, but I think one of the most interesting things, I actually can't remember which read it came from. One of the executives said there's a cohort of folks who have really high earning potential now. And it was a residential read actually, and they were talking about residential demand because they will be AI enabled and because their productivity will be so enhanced. And I think that really is the case. And so there are some companies that are being really thoughtful about how that's going to shift demand at the very least. I've heard it less in terms of how they're going to deploy the technology themselves within their companies. And again, going back to what I just said, I know for a fact there are some companies that are doing that, and I think they will benefit. But that's kind of how I would summarize that.
It's interesting you talk about productivity. A couple of weeks ago, I was challenged by somebody because I was saying that I felt two of the biggest justifications for innovation. And by the way, when I'm going to go back a step here and talk about prop tech, a decade plus ago, I was a big advocate for prop tech, and I was, flying the flag, and I was getting very frustrated, 5+ years ago, that no one was adopting prop tech properly. And it was because I realized it wasn't a big driver of change. It was a symptom of change. It wasn't the driver of change. And I then said to somebody a few weeks ago, I said, look, prop tech is the engine, construction tech is the engine, all the technology solutions are the engines, but the drivers are sustainability and the drivers are affordability. To which this gentleman said, yeah, it's fine.
Couldn't agree more, by the way.
But he then said, but you're forgetting the one element which is really important here, which is productivity. He said, if you go into a real estate company and say affordability, they're going to say no. Sustainability, yes, but affordability, no, because it's a societal challenge that technology can enable, not a business challenge. So the business challenge is productivity. So that I found that quite interesting. You've looped that in to that. On that sustainability issue, I am assuming, so please tell me or argue that I'm wrong here, that sustainability has also been mentioned an awful lot in the calls that you've listened into, or is that not being picked up by your keyword searches and all that sort of stuff?
So I actually want to go back a step, and I want to add a third one. So the productivity affordability thing is interesting, but as I view it, it actually is sustainability. It is affordability. And the third one is customer experience. And
still there. Okay.
Let me unpack that a little bit. So, and I'll come back to sustainability. Like when you say affordability is a societal challenge, well, it's really not actually. I assume you have an iPhone in your pocket right now.
I no.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But I have a smartphone.
Okay. Well, look, I think. Well, I have one, and I think an iPhone is incredibly inexpensive for what you get, or any smartphone really, because everybody kind of needs to compete, because for what they give you, and the amount of utility you get out of it, and how sophisticated that device is, there is an insane amount of execution detail that went into the sourcing of every component and the distribution of every component to get that in your pocket for however few hundreds of dollars they might have done so. I think when you think about Tesla, like one of the most genius things they did was the Model S was, for what you got, it was half the price of a comparable, big German luxury sedan. And in a lot of cases offered better performance, right? And then they offered kind of the Model 3 at, a price point of $30,000 to $40,000 here in the US that was affordable to anybody. And again, the amount of execution detail throughout the supply chain, the automation required in the factories to make that happen, is where the real true innovation was. And so, like, these products that I'm describing are so freaking cheap for what they are. They're so cheap. Like, maybe in some cases, like half the cost of the legacy things that the legacy products that were out there, for what you got. And it's because there was this extremely thoughtful approach to sourcing every component and building the product from a first principles business perspective. Yeah. I think one of the biggest problems within the real estate industry, at least as I see it here in the US, and maybe it's different elsewhere, is nobody is applying that model to real estate. And I think there's a couple reasons for it. One is the scale is just tremendous. And then the other is, I think there's a legacy in ecosystem within real estate where you have your capital providers, you have your developers, you have your contractors, you have your people who provide, lumber and, concrete and, quartz and all these other building materials, and they're all disparate. And there's nobody who's kind of come in, and there's people who have tried and are now trying like assembly lines, but even they are like kind of building modular components and then throwing them together at a construction site. But there are very few people who start with the end consumer in mind on the one end and the raw materials needed for what they're providing to them on the other, and manage everything in-house end to end and cost engineer the whole thing. And so that's why, and that's not the only reason why, but that's one of the reasons why real estate feels so unaffordable for what you get, in my opinion. So
it's a really interesting insight. I hadn't really considered that angle. So that's cool.
Yeah. So that's on affordability. It is a business challenge. And it's easy to say like, oh, like it's impossible and this is just how it works. But that's a really interesting problem to me, I think. And then the other thing on sustainability, yeah, there's a lot of that now. And I think every firm is investing heavily in a team that is moving towards net zero or close to it within a pretty swift timeline here.
Which by the way, I find fascinating, because I agree with what you've just said. And I would argue that there are many, many, many more sustainability teams than there are innovation teams.
There are. Yeah. And I'll tell you why. It's because they have to. It's because it's been regulated in a lot of cases.
But the irony on that is the sustainability teams, in my view, maybe I'm wrong, will need innovative technologies in order to implement some of the strategies they will be running.
Yeah, most of that innovation is not coming in-house, and that's all I'll say on that point. I think
that it's a contradiction, right? We have real estate industries, because they need to have sustainability, will bring in sustainability and literally departments, and they will not be bringing, or they haven't got innovation capacity to test or to facilitate what is needed to make sustainability happen.
Real estate is a cost side business. 15 years ago, folks used to say green is red, green being sustainability, red being it's expensive and it doesn't drive any return. There's less of a, hey, we're going to go build something that's 10 times better, 10 times more sustainable, 10 times more aligned with what the end consumer wants, and we're going to charge a premium for it. That's hard to prove out. And again, it's extremely difficult to experiment. So there's good reason why nobody really wants to go prove that out. They'd rather look at what's tried and true and cut costs. So that's true on the innovation side. And most of the innovations that are deployed at large real estate companies are cost-saving innovations.
Okay, so let me just put, so honestly, I know, because I know you've got to go. So this is going to be my final question, which is linked to that.
Sure.
I have a running thesis in my head that we have a serious challenge around leadership within the industry, and that we are looking far too short term. And what you've just said there about cutting costs and thinking of customer-centric initiatives is too short term, and we're not looking far enough in the future at what might be coming around. And they often talk about the innovator's dilemma being customer-centric. We listen to our customers, which is a good thing on one hand, and we listen to what they want and we adapt. But at the same time, we listen to our customers and we adapt, which is a bad thing, because we're only listening to our best customers and adapting to their needs, which gives us an innovator's dilemma, because we forget about innovations of new customers and new potential opportunities. So my question to you to finish is, are we as an industry looking too short term, and we're not looking far enough in advance to look at what's coming around the corner? Yes.
And I think if you've tuned in today, which, I hope you have, and I hope you learned something and it was helpful, reach out to me or James if you have further questions. But for a lot of the reasons we described today, that is the case. And I think what it would require is, to change that, are some true visionary leaders with capital backing, really patient capital that's willing to take a risk, perhaps on a scale never before seen in the real estate industry. because to create the Apple or the Tesla of real estate would cost considerable amount of money, and would require looking really far into the future, or at least looking at what's coming around the corner and building things for the long term, and doing things because they are you want to build an amazing end product for the person who is going to be living next to that real estate, working in that real estate. Starting with that in mind, and then, completely redesigning the value chain. And I'm hopeful that will happen. I'm hopeful that I'll see that in my lifetime, but it's a big task for sure.
It is. And listen, on that note, I'm going to finish. Damien, I saw your question come in. Thanks ever so much for that. I didn't have time to mention it, but good to see you, and I hope all's well. Right, I am going to end this in. Ehson, just stay there for a second, but publicly, thanks ever so much for taking the time. It's early where you are, and I appreciate you giving me your insights. So.